Thank you very much. Just another quick sound check. Everyone here okay?
Yep.
I'll take that as a, yep, thanks. I'm putting in the chat area a link to the slides, which we'll be using, a PDF version. And actually, that's a link to the slides we're using for your reference. And we have a number of links we'll talk through. And that's for later to come back to. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a moment. Can everyone see that okay?
Yep.
Good. I'll take that as a yes. And let's community update here in the annual conference 2021. Great to be here with you all. Going very well. The three co-chairs will be three of us talking today. Ed Silverton, I'm Ronald Haynes, and Julie Winchester. And we'll be passing off to each other as and when appropriate. If you haven't come across us before, I hope you will join us sometime. We meet monthly. In the slides, you'll find a link to the group page. And over the last year, we've had special calls. I will say a bit more about that with a little more technical focus. Both are open to anyone, and you don't have to sign your life away to come along and see what's up. And we're also very keen to have a bit of cross-connection with similar groups where we overlap, museums, archives, maps, etc. Like other groups, a lot of knowledge sharing and discussion. We have a broad range of participants. That's a very small list. And we have started the process to work toward, and we aim to fulfill the requirements to start a technical specification group for 3D in IIIF. And this is roughly what we've mapped out. Some of you may have seen a version of this before. We've updated a bit, and we're aiming through later this calendar year to try to have worked out some of the various details from the technical and community documentation that's required to design sketching. And there'll be hints of some of this in our presentation today, plus demos, which we've been big on all along, and we'll continue with those, and then proposals to go through the process. There are complexities and challenges. Some of you may have seen this before, but for those who haven't, just to briefly explain, this is a synthesis of some key conversations, concerns, challenge statements put in from various discussions from a few years back, the Victoria and Albert V&A technical IIIF meeting, some work out of a specialist group in Pisa. And we've synthesized these as some of the key areas and issues, and we'll be addressing some of these as we go along. But the questions come up about showing 3D objects in a IIIF context today. Well, we don't have the APIs and the standards, but as these things go, things are moving along, and we'll show you some of that. Units and resolutions are very interesting, scaling, orientation. It's curious to know that some use rectilinear, a Z dimension. Others use polar coordinates, particularly some of the Google work. And you can translate between the two. So anyone with a enthusiasm for geometry, always love to have conversations about that, because it's part of our roadmap to work that out. What options are best? There's painting, lighting, navigation, camera angle, point of view. There are all sorts of things, but there are a lot of people who know a lot about this, and thankfully we've had a lot of good discussions bringing these various people together, and us being part of this collaborative effort, which is the only way we're going to make it work. I'm not going to spend too much longer on this, because we're going to come to some of the later questions, including what would a 3D manifest look like, and metadata involved with it. For now, I'll hand over to you, Ed.
Okie doke. So some themes and functionalities identified in the group so far. can I show 3D objects via IIIF today? And what could a 3D manifest look like? So we've got a few examples lined up. So next slide, please. So there are three, whoops. Oh, I've lost the screen share there. I think Ronald may have dropped off the call.
Yeah, I think that may be the case.
Sounded like his connection was a little fuzzy for a bit there on my end. I don't know if you've all heard that, but
Yeah, here, I can get the slides going back.
oh, I think
Thanks.
Oh,
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Yeah.
let's-
Yes.
It kicked me out of one when I went to another. So,
Okay, there's two of you now, and you're both co-hosts.
sorry, I was trying to be too clever with this. Shall I go back to sharing?
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
Two Ronalds for the price of one now.
Can you see it?
I can see your Hoover screen, but I can't see the slides.
Ah, sorry about that, everyone. Are we there?
Yep.
Thanks.
Right, so we need to go forward a bit and one more.
Yeah.
So there's three platforms using this kind of loose kind of IIIF 3D idea at the moment. Duke University's MorphoSource, who Julie works with, Royal Pavilion and Museums, who are based in Brighton, where I am, and that's a kind of a system we put together for them. And also the University of St Andrews publishing 3D manifests that are being used in their exhibit.so platform. And then we've got a few examples there. There's also the British Library have some objects in this format, in GLB format, that are being shared over, they're hosted on GitHub. And then you can see the green finch there from Royal Pavilion and a gorilla skull from MorphoSource. These are all GLB files, I believe. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then those are the manifests. So let's go to the next slide, and we can sort of look a bit closer at those. So this is what the Jane Austen writing desk manifest looks like. So basically it's a GLTF binary file, GLB, being annotated with a painting motivation onto a canvas. So it's much like an image being annotated onto a canvas, except it's non-standard at the moment, but it works. It's kind of one way. It's a way of doing it. And yeah, we're using the MIME type there, the format to specify that this is a 3D model that we're annotating. Next, please. Yeah, so it works, but it has limits. We're not able to place or transform the 3D object. We're just simply saying this object goes on this canvas. We can't say where it goes on the canvas, or what rotation. We can't really combine multiple objects, so we can annotate multiple GLBs on them because we can't specify their positions relative to each other. And it's not, you can't then currently annotate the 3D model further, so to add kind of textual commentary to it and things like that. So it's very simple at the moment. Next slide, please. I think back to Ronald.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Thanks. So we mentioned some of the challenges and some of the guiding questions. This is another look at some of the challenges, particularly to interoperability. People have different workflows, different capture approaches, different output formats, the post-production, which is very important, and where a lot of things get finalized for use. There is a significant difference between the photogrammetry, which is perhaps largely the most popular way people are creating models. But of course, we have laser and structured light, CT, MRI, etc., and 3D modeling. Photogrammetry has raised an interesting set of questions. The others also raise, perhaps with CT and MRI, in that there are a lot of 2D images that are used to build up a 3D model. And so one of the things we've started to see people interested in doing and looking for ways of doing this is to keep the 2D images as well as the generated 3D object. That's more obvious with CT and MRI. It tends to be a stack of the images that are the virtual slices through an object. Photogrammetry, all of the 2D images that are taken to surround an object. It's becoming important to keep those, particularly because algorithms for generating 3D models in photogrammetry keep changing. And in the future, we expect they'll keep improving, but the 2D images will still be a very important source and are data sets that are increasingly going to be important, including for publication purposes and archiving purposes. Anyway, the various output formats we know and see and with which we all work. Then the questions of access and scale, as we mentioned earlier, let alone access issues of copywriting and licensing. So 3 quick questions about factors for interoperability. Do we need objects to be nested inside each other to be able to recreate a room, a church, a temple, cathedral, etc., palace, a house? Enable labeling viewing across repositories so we can put back together pieces that are in separated collections, and then maybe able to mix them in VRAR, WebXR format. And persistent IDs, there are a number of projects looking at this to be able to keep track of models and different generations of models as people will continue to improve on them. And publishers, for instance, want to know what was the model that was definitive for our publication, and then what are later derivatives or improvements. So moving on. We have 3 key areas among other work we do. We've been collecting for some time user stories, and there is a quick link to that, and we invite any and all to please share your stories. And it's a very simple form, just trying to get some idea of and make sure we cover enough areas. And we have a fairly good response so far, but we just want to make sure whatever needs you identify are taken into account as we move forward. And hopefully you'll bring that to discussions anyway. 3D workflows, we haven't done quite as much with that, and perhaps that's because it's still fairly, there are some overlaps, but very different in some areas too. So again, please contribute. The viewer comparison we've done a bit more with and had a number of specialty meetings, and those meetings are also touching on the technical specification challenges were come before us because they're very much connected together. The viewers will have to change, and we're going to show a little bit more why in a moment. And there's a link to the group. We'll come back to these later. Over to you, Julie.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that have been generated by the community group in 2021. Because we've been taking stock of all of the challenges that Ronald was summarizing, sort of the limitations that Ed went through about the limitations of the current sort of in practice informal way of displaying 3D objects using IIIF manifests. And a lot of our discussions started from this pretty basic question of if you start with a IIIF canvas, conceptually speaking, how do you represent 3D objects across a broad range of use cases? And all of our discussions started with, a standard IIIF 2D image use case. You have a canvas. The canvas is bounded. It has some finite dimensions, 400 by 400 pixels, 1200 by 800, something like that. And then you annotate a 2D image resource on that 2D canvas. Next slide, please. So the way current examples of working with 3D in IIIF work is they maintain that canvas, and then they place a single, painting annotation of a sort of a model, GLB 3D model file on the canvas. And at least for the two extensions in the universal viewer that can currently handle 3D, that's model viewer and Aleph, those viewers know, okay, I have a 2D canvas. I am going to take this 3D object. I'm going to place a 3D space on the 2D canvas, or you could even think of it, I'm going to place a viewport into that 3D space on the 2D canvas. And so we've been sort of calling that idea a sort of a 2D first way of approaching 3D, because you still have a 2D bounded finite dimension canvas as sort of the ground layer upon which you annotate your 3D objects. There are other approaches though. Next slide, please. So yeah, the alternate approach here would be, well, what if instead of placing a 3D thing on the 2D canvas, what if the canvas itself became 3D? What if you extruded a Z-axis from the canvas? In this circumstance, unlike the 2D canvas with its finite dimensions, like a frame, 3D spaces tend to be unbounded. They tend to be voids. They tend to, this is why we sort of refer to the infinite canvas as a concept. And so if you had this infinite canvas, then you could, place objects directly in your 3D space, which, we could call that a 3D first use case. Which, next slide, please. So over time, a lot of our discussions ended up with these sort of two examples, this 2D first use case or 3D first use case. And we sort of arrived at the idea that probably it's best to create sort of an architecture of a solution that can handle both of these things. Because as I'll talk about in a little bit, both of these approaches actually address different but both important use cases. And the root of one solution for this is not necessarily the solution, but it's a solution, and we would love to hear feedback, is to rely on the fact that canvases are nestable, that you can take a canvas and you can put it inside another canvas, so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So the suggestion here is that basically to add a new concept alongside the idea of the canvas, which can also be nested, known as a scene. Whereas a scene is very much like a canvas, but it has that Z-axis, it has 3 dimensions, it's unbounded, and then canvases can nest inside of scenes and vice versa. Scenes can nest inside of canvases, which those two things, the new scene and the nestability, allow you to address potentially a lot of different use cases with a IIIF manifest. On the left side of the screen, if you want to put multiple 3D viewports into totally different 3D spaces on a 2D space, if you want to put multiple objects in a 2D first context, you could do that by taking a canvas and then nesting multiple scenes inside of that canvas. Or alternately on the right, if you want to start with a 3D space, you can actually start with the scene and then place a couple of 3D objects inside of that scene. But then you can also actually annotate a 2D image into the 3D scene by sort of placing the canvas inside the scene and then annotating the 2D image on the canvas. Next slide, please. Yeah, and the use cases these indicate is sort of like Ronald was saying, being able to reconstruct a room, a palace, that would be creating a digital diorama, which is what you can do with the right side case. The left side would be if you want to create a gallery list of things. And yeah, so next thing down, next slide, please.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, next slide, please. Are we having difficulties? That's fine. The core point I also wanted to make is this doesn't actually even necessarily require inventing a whole new second concept. You know, we don't have to invent like a new scene concept that is equal to canvas, because scenes, even though I've been using that term, canvas and scenes are really kind of the same thing, just with slightly different properties. So you could think of a scene as a canvas, but with 3 dimensions and unbounded. So, you know, if you can just sort of play with the properties of your canvas in that sense, they just become 2 different canvases, which are nestable and sort of turtles all the way down. Perhaps we've lost the slides again, but that's okay, because we were actually, the next part of the talk that we're going to move into is we are going to live dangerously, and we're actually going to have, we have 2 demos to show to try and sort of demonstrate some of these concepts that we're talking about in action. The first, I'll be giving the first demo, and Ed will be giving the second. So actually, let me see if I can share my screen here.
Julie,
Hey,
can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, it got disconnected. Are you okay?
No worries. Yeah, I'm good. I was just about to move into the Hubs demo.
Great.
So yeah, so I think we don't even need the slides for right now. Okay, is that screen share working?
Yes.
Great.
Right.
So this is Hubs. It's a product by Mozilla. It's free to use, and Hubs is a multi-user online browser-based sort of digital diorama tool, which it allows you to. So you can see I can actually move around in this space. There's a table over there, which we will come back to in a second, and I can move around in this space. I could have joined through mobile. I could have joined through VR. Other people could join this room with me, in which case I'd be able to see them here. If they were in VR, they would even have hands that they could wave with. We can talk to each other. But the nice thing about Hubs is that it's possible to modify the room. So these images, and also these images down here, were actually created from a IIIF image API. They're not put into Hubs with a IIIF manifest. The actual file binaries have to be dropped directly into Hubs, but you can see the picture on the left and then a section of the picture on the right that was created using a IIIF image API. But in the 3D context, the other thing this allows us to do is to create digital dioramas of 3D content from entirely separate resources and then put them in the same digital space where multiple people could participate. So we have a gorilla skull and a bird specimen. They're both hosted on MorphoSource. The mounted greenfinch, which is from the Royal Pavilion and Museums Trust, and the Jane Austen desk, provided by the British Library and hosted via exhibit.so. So yeah, this is basically combining multiple resources in one space. We can, get up close, examine them. If I was in VR, I could actually get, crouch down and look at these things directly. And so, yeah, Ronald's example of bringing things from different repositories together, perhaps things that were separated or lost, fragments of multiple things brought back together. It is technically feasible to do that in a common digital space. Of course, I will say this isn't relying on IIIF manifests, and it would be much more powerful if we could rely on IIIF manifests. But I think that actually leads me into Ed's demo. Ed?
Yeah, So also the table that those objects were on is from Sketchfab.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So let me share my screen. That coming through?
Yep.
Cool. So
Yes.
this is so Julie mentioned the infinite canvas, the kind of unbounded 3D space that we can annotate things into. So I was quite inspired by this idea and decided to try and create a demo of it. So this is infinitecanvas.versal.app. So this is a zoomable scene. I'm loading in IIIF content here from the National Gallery of Art in the US and from the VNA's IIIF service. And because I've been working, I mean, I guess I've been working with IIIF a long time, so I was able to kind of understand how to scale the images so that they, you know, it's identical to how a regular IIIF viewer would scale these images, and also page them so they're kind of grouped if they have a page viewing hint, etc. So these are actually multi-scale images. It's kind of a simplified version, but it won't be visible over Zoom. But as I'm going through these, they're loading in a higher resolution version when the 3D camera gets close to them. So you're also able to load in a 3D model here. So if I click on this menu up here, I'm able to drive the experience around. And yeah, we've got a 3D model here. This is Google's sort of canonical astronaut example. So that's also a GLB that we were mentioning earlier. Here's a video from NASA. And this is actually zoomable as well. And so we have a kind of continuous space here that we can put multi-resolution images into 3D files, audio-visual content, and mix it all up. So yeah, this is kind of obviously a work in progress, but it kind of demonstrates, I think, the kind of the infinite canvas concept, 3D first concept, and just to prove that it is definitely a 3D space. This is my kind of local version with a rotate enabled option. So there we go. You can see the VNA's IIIF codecs going off into infinity and beyond there. Okay, so that's my I think that's my demo. So who am I handing back to? Do you want to round it off, Ronald?
I think, yeah. So let me just find my slides again. Okay. And we started to have some questions, which is good, and comments, which we'll get to shortly. There'll be plenty of time for those questions and comments. Let me see if I can share this now. Meg or someone would. I think I have to be re-enabled to share, unless Jill, you want to take over.
Try it now,
to share
Ronald?
the slides. Oh, Josh. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, got it. Thank you. Good. Good. You seeing that okay?
Yep.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay, so we've had the two demonstrations. Thank you both, Julie and Ed. And we're nearly at the end of the deck. So as we said, plenty of time for discussion and further investigation. These are some related references, including our slide decks from the fall working meeting last December, and indeed from the IIIF week a year ago, if you want, for some of the greatest hits from before. Sketchfab Cultural Heritage User Survey, it is a slightly older one, but it has a lot of interesting information, including about user stories, user needs, and experience. There's a lot of work going on in the EU, EC funded, on things like quality and complexity in tangible cultural heritage. Project's been run out of the Cyprus University of Technology, Marinos Ioannidis, who's been involved with the IIIF 3D group. And many of us have been in touch and presenting at each other's sessions. That is some of the results they got from a survey on quality and digitization, tangible cultural heritage. And those conversations are continuing because just as we have an active IIIF and Europeana discussions, there's a lot of interest in working together to collaboratively define this standardization process so that we all will be able to share our cultural heritage materials, which is what we all want, of course. For those who don't know, the Europeana project, and there are some other related funded projects, but their goal is to try to digitize the European cultural heritage, and they've been going for more than 10 years. And in more recent years, we had a lot to do on the traditional IIIF bit, and they had a particular task force on 3D, and we were involved with some of those discussions and presentations. So there's a little bit of that written up in all of this, and some guides on cultural heritage that's also from the European community's approach to all this. So if you know of other key resources to share, please do share them with us. Come to a meeting or just drop us a line. And the final thing before we open up for discussion is to recap the three sort of areas that are particularly active, and then the group itself in our regular meetings. In the viewer comparison, we've in recent time been joined by the Deutsche Museum, who have a particularly good work they've done on viewer comparison themselves. We're combining forces, and even more recently from the JPEG and MPEG consortium members, who they're very interested in 3D as well. And in particular, specialist displays known as light field displays. Some of you may know Looking Glass, based out of Brooklyn and Shenzhen, China. So these discussions are all fruitful, and everyone wants the same sort of thing, is not reinventing wheels and making sure things work across platforms. It's a big area, big challenges, but thankfully a lot of people up for the challenge. With that, I'll stop sharing and come back in. I think we can open up for question and discussion. Unless Julie or Ed, you would have anything else to add?
I think moving to a question sounds great.
Great. Shall I read the first one? There's one question and then a number of chat things. Moving forward, this is Patrick Kuba. Would it be helpful to have a special name for the type of canvas that is used for video and audio resources instead of overloading the 2D canvas? Julie, Ed, you want to field that first?
If I can throw a possible answer on, which, you know, I think these are ideas that I think actually originate with Ed and sort of a technical specification document. Ed made some. I'll let him speak to it. But you know, I feel like, I guess as a developer, I would more inclined to think of it as, well, maybe canvases should start to be thought of as sort of bundles of different component properties, and depending on what component property one sticks on the canvas, it becomes a different basic thing, which, you know, you could have special names, but in that sense, you know, a 2D canvas has, you know, X dimension, Y dimension, and, you know, finite dimensions. You know, a scene type canvas would have X, Y, and Z dimensions. It would be unbounded. I saw there's some discussion in the chat about audio canvases, which, you know, it seems, yeah, that maybe a specific way of describing them would just be to start listing canvases by the properties they have. But Ed, I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, that's basically the way I see it. That a canvas could potentially just be devoid of any properties. It could be there's a concept in the game industry called the entity component system, where you have entities which have, they're completely devoid of any properties on their own, and then when you add components to them, you can give them things like dimensions, rotation, and even weight and speed, and all these sorts of things. And this is a very, very common way of doing things in the game industry. And I thought that perhaps there were some correlations there between the canvas model and the entity component system model, where basically you start with nothing and then you add on or annotate the dimensions or properties that you need specific to your use case.
Yeah, and if I may plow in, some of our discussions have also talked about serious use cases that will need pretty much all of these resources. So for instance, we have cases of people working on reconstructing cathedrals from Florence, for instance, a big project in a couple of universities here in the UK. And what they want to do, or at least what they'd like to be able to do, is repopulate, also the Medici Palace out of Florence. What they'd like to do is repopulate some of the materials, both wall hanging portraits, paintings, and also statues in various parts, and perhaps be able to replay a composition that was created for that space. So we certainly have people in music faculty who have done some of this work. So what would the piece that was designed for a particular space, cathedral, palace, what would it sound like in a recreated version of that space? So we also will need animation. So we'll need, just like audio-visual material, we'll need temporality. And so we're not talking about static scenes in many cases, or at least need the option of animation, and therefore audio and video properties. So the scenes are going to need to be able to handle all of this in some ways.
Yeah, I think the name scene is
that
possibly just a way of saying shorthand for it's a canvas with a Z dimension on it as well, possibly.
Yeah, good point.
It's not a distinct thing.
Patrick, do you want to come back on that? Yeah, thanks. Patrick, is that okay, or and should we move on, or do you want to come back?
That's good. Yeah, I'm thinking of a developer who plans to support, say, only a art history painting aspect, and instead of then looking at the type of thing, they would have to do a sort of feature detection to see if the canvas is the kind of canvas that they're expecting to display.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what would be interesting too, I don't know if anyone's here from the National Gallery, but in some quick discussions, is it worth thinking that paintings are also 3D, particularly if you wanted the framing or anything about its mounting to be represented, rather than just the face of it, or even the depth of oils on canvas. Is that of interest to anyone or concern? Maybe not. Patrick, I'm going to mark yours as answered and come back to it if we needs be. In the chat area, shall we go from the top? Rob, you talk about interop factors. Your answers would be yes, yes, and no. Can you explain a little bit or come back on that, please?
Sure. So if I recall the questions correctly, they were, do we need to be able to nest three-dimensional representations inside the bounds of another three-dimensional representation? So my answer to that would be yes, with use cases like we need to be able to put the, well, as you've already demonstrated, the skull on top of, or indeed underneath, the table. The no was persistent identifiers. That seems out of scope for a IIIF spec. super useful, but a very, very complex political, social problem rather than a technical problem. And I forget what the other interrupt factor was, I'm afraid, off the top of my head.
No, sorry, those are the three main ones you recapped. Could I just, sorry, go ahead. Could I come back on the persistent IDs? We don't spend much time on it, but I think some of you know there's a UK funded Tour de National collection, multiple projects, and one of them is on persistent IDs being run based out of the National Gallery. Julie, you might want to say you all use ARC identifiers, among other things, and we've talked whether DOI is needed. This may be out of IIIF scope, but in the community, this has bubbled up.
Yeah, I do think that persistent IDs are a continual question, and yeah, at MorphoSource we do use ARC persistent identifiers for everything. When people want to say publish with 3D media, we provide DOIs for specific individual media. But yeah, I think the topic of persistent identifiers has to be connected into specific repositories of record, because theoretically you could have everyone creating an arbitrary number of persistent identifiers for any object as long as they're all linked together. But you know, because this is actually a thing, because we work often with biological collections where you have a record for a media and a record representing the biological specimen that was imaged in the media. And we don't give persistent identifiers for the specimens, even though people want them, because we're not a repository of record for specimens. And so I feel like it's a conversation that has to be, you have to think about persistent IDs from where and for what. But yeah, no, maybe it's not entirely in the IIIF scope as such, but it's good to think of how to hook persistent identifiers into whatever we build, I feel.
And at least not close off the option. People want it in metadata, etc.
Right.
That's something that's come up with some of the academic publishers as well. They definitely want to be able to distinguish things. But point taken, Rob, about what's in and out of IIIF scope. Tom Crane, I don't know if you want to come on mic. IIIF 3 allows canvases to be painted onto canvases all the way down. Love the turtle image, Julie. Stacked turtles is the only difference that the scene is unbounded. Julie, Ned, do you want to go for that?
I think Tom is pretty much on point. Yeah, I think the difference is that the scene is unbounded and that it has a 3D or it has a Z axis. I suppose also sort of minor differences, things like 3D spaces usually refer to a coordinate origin at the very center, whereas 2D things, I think like IIIF canvas, top left corner is the coordinate origin. So maybe some small differences like that, but I think the unbounded nature and the Z axis are the big features, I would think.
I agree with that.
Yeah, Ed, coming in. Okay.
Yeah. I was just saying.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things. Oh, thanks. Sorry. One of the things we've also talked about is whether we're going to need something like a translation layer to go between coordinate systems, between measurement systems, etc. Mentioned before, and Ed, you've talked a lot about this, polar coordinates used by Google Model Viewer and maybe some others, which is not typical, but translatable. So we're going to need some way to match up between different systems because different objects will come with that baggage.
Yeah, there are two types of annotation. It's annotating objects into a scene, but it's then annotating those objects themselves. And the strategies for that are many. So yeah, that's a very, very complex problem.
It's all good fun. Tom, do you want to come back in on that, or is that okay?
Yeah, no, that was my understanding. Just one more question then. So is the Z index, if you had a Z index to the canvas, is it still a kind of integer coordinate system, regardless of where the origin is? So there's a kind of potentially primitive mechanism of annotation where you're like just annotating a small amount of little cubes, but at least that allows you to target part of the space, even if it's not the kind of annotations you might want to do on surfaces within that space. There's something you could do there that is in keeping with the integer coordinate system of a IIIF canvas today.
I think so,
Okay.
yeah.
Ed, Julie?
Yeah, I mean,
Great.
you could treat it as cubes, and you're annotating those cubes relative to the top left front corner of each parent cube. I don't know whether, because the convention with 3D scenes is that the origin is the origin is the kind of center of the universe, and then it's kind of unbounded. So it's kind of squaring that circle, I guess, of
I think
how do you relate those two types of spaces, and
I think the difficulty in squaring it is that in IIIF up to now, the canvas actually it's an abstract representation of something in the real world. It's the space taken up by a painting, or the space taken up by a page of a book, or the length of time of a recording. Whereas the 3D canvas is subtly different from that, because it's not, there's usually not an analog. It's not the kind of bounding box of the cathedral, because that doesn't have any kind of real world sense to it. So that, and then that's why they do have different coordinate systems and different origins, because they are subtly different. It's not just adding an extra dimension, and that I can see why you have the problems.
I think the way I've thought about it before is that the 3D space is the world into which things are put. It's not the thing being put in the world.
Yeah. But obviously in our 2D IIIF, the fact that a canvas is an abstract representation of a space allows us to annotate transcriptions onto it, and to annotate segments of audio, and all those other kind of use cases. So it's it's just like ensuring that the kind of, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater of those kind of use cases in order to place 3D objects in a world.
Oh, I definitely agree. I think there's a strong need to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, to not sacrifice everything that the canvas is capable of doing. Which I suppose that's where what I've always thought, that the utility of sort of nesting canvases and scenes, or nesting standard canvases with 3D canvases, nesting 3D canvases inside of standard canvases. Because then it gives you all those things that you would have in the standard 2D canvas, but then you can sort of have like a nice little boxed off child, where you're going to say, okay, now we're going to have a world here or something, or vice versa, in order to try and sort of, eat our cake and have it too. And
it is possible. So in 3D game engines and things like that, you have world space and local space. So you can have multiple spaces in a 3D world. So that's, if you were to say this cube, is a local space that we're annotating within, but usually you're annotating relative to the center of that cube, not some corner of it. So it is possible to create these sort of mini universes within the larger world to annotate within. But it's where does the origin lie?
But picking up on that, some of our discussions have suggested this metaphor of a diorama, that we create a space of particular boundaries, a particular measurement in the 3 physical dimensions, and within that space place objects. Now that could either be the cathedral you mentioned, Tom, that could be the cathedral, or it could be the space around it, but you predefine that diorama space. And then some of the suggestions were, you don't have to absolutely position every piece within it, because it could be relative to the boundary of that box, and that box could be imaginary. You don't have to show the box, you just need that which is one of the analogs of putting a Z dimension out of the canvas, and then positioning things relative to that, even if the box then retranslates to the center of that box, because there are physical limitations to whatever we're going to place in, and it can be adjusted just as a 2D canvas can be. At least that's some of the discussions that come up. Tom, maybe you can come back in a minute if we cover the other things. Patrick, you made a point, an audio canvas unbounded, it has its duration. These specialties may get confusing soon and need better language. Yeah, one of the things, I guess, is that people talk about time as a dimension, and we're going to get tangled if we say time's a dimension and there's a third Z dimension. But yeah, so maybe we come up with special terms, like maybe quark names, charm, up, down, that kind of thing. So charm, I like, you know. Yanthi, you love the demos, that's great, as did some others, thanks. Regis and Richard, good to see you here. David, Ed, you're gonna blush when you read this later. And Patrick, excellent. And Richard, I won't go and speculate whether we're all figments of Ed's imagination. I don't want to jinx his imagination of the rest of us. Thanks, Josh, for the framing. Just keeping one eye on the time. Let's just make sure we don't miss anything that you want to be sure to cover. Patrick, do you want to come back in on your audio canvas point, or are we okay?
I think we've talked about it. The idea basically just as a developer, you would need a clear idea of how to test for the things that you're trying to build for. And if canvas becomes an empty object, then right, in the game sense, it would be, am I going to render, if I'm only rendering wireframes, I don't want the texture, I don't want the messages. I'm just trying to show you what I'm limited to. So if what you're doing is looking through photographs of portraits, I'm going to give you something very different than if I expect 3D models to be inset in that space.
Yeah, no, thanks. And Patrick, you made the point about height and width, and yeah, okay. We'll have to, we'll come back on all this. That's very helpful. Just trying to make sure if anyone else hasn't had a chance to be heard. Simeon, I'm curious about the idea of a 3D viewport in a 2D canvas, but not sure about the UX. Imagine. What are your thoughts about the expected UX? Julie, Ed, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can try and jump in on that. Well, I think it's an interesting question, because I feel like I don't know, just thinking of web pages as a kind of canvas, I feel like the vast majority of usage of 3D resources on the web anywhere right now is essentially putting a 2D, you know, a Sketchfab page is putting a viewport into a single object 3D space in a 2D space. And, you know, similarly at MorphoSource, when on a media page, you know, we have media metadata, and then we have a little pane that has the viewport into the 3D space. And typically, in most of these examples, I feel like the viewport in the 3D space sort of has its own sort of floating, sort of pseudo 2D, you know, UI panels for user interaction. And I mean, I feel like that's a start. There are probably better ways of thinking about it. You know, if you're going to think of a canvas as sort of a singular experience of 2D media and 3D media, there's probably more smoother ways, yeah, to think about how to make the UX of the 3D viewport from the 2D into 3D, you know, I don't know, yeah, more intuitive, more gripping.
Thanks. Ed, do you want to jump in at all?
So it's a very difficult subject. UX, I mean, the UX of VR, immersive spaces, and I mean, where do you draw the line? It seems to me that digital is on a path to recreating as closely as possible our experience of the real world, and these are, you know, the UX of the real world is everyone's quite familiar with, and everything else is just kind of a poor man's kind of, if you like, kind of version of it. Until we, I always think about the quote books are sharks, by the author of by Douglas Adams. You know, he sort of said that, you know, books are sharks and they've evolved as far as they need to, and they don't need to change anymore because they're perfect. And if we're trying to recreate books digitally, and maybe the end game for that is ultimately just to have a book that works exactly like a book, and it's not kind of an abstract, some kind of digital abstraction of it.
I'm tempted to say, if in case anyone's not seen it, it's a great, hilarious Norwegian skit about a medieval help desk when moving from scroll to book, and people needing help in the new user experience, in the UI of a book. And when you turn it over, have you lost everything? It's easily found, and there are nice subtitles for it. In the time remaining, Tom, you were waxing lyrically about time. There are points that we may have to reconsider some of the things we've abstracted and done for convenience. We scan books, which are 3D objects, and put them in flat 2D environments. But as you're saying, Ed, maybe we should go back to a book. And there, I think the USC example they were talking about, their AR example, was to be able to hold virtually a map or a book or something using AR. And that's an interesting point. There are people talking about AR being able to get rid of screens, for instance. And there are a lot, Lenovo and others are working on this. So you have virtual screens in front of you. You no longer need a TV or a big monitor on the wall or on your desk. It's just all in front of your eyes. Interesting thought.
Right. Well, you know, because I would say it's not just the page. It's not the scroll, the book that is 2D. It's also screens. Screens are also fundamentally 2D, and we've made so many, you know, UX design assumptions about how we interact with digital objects based on a fundamentally flat paradigm, which, yeah, I mean, AR and VR sort of maybe like threaten to sort of overturn the game board in terms of that. But I think it's why sometimes people struggle with 3D resources online, because, well, it's in 3D, so it's like the world, but you're accessing an artificial world through the abstraction layer of a 2D screen in most cases. So it's through a looking glass darkly.
Very good. Josh, you made a great point about duration property as an interesting middle ground, and a couple of people, Tom and others, talked about the time aspect. And yeah, I think it's always been a mapping from gesture to function, Stephen says, and there are pressure screens. You're right, and there are even tactile feedback screens. So people are trying to augment reality with all 5 senses, even some on taste, which is the tougher one, but smell, hearing, sight, obviously, we focus on a lot. So maybe sometime we'd be a little more holistic about all this. We're coming up to the end of the hour. I don't know how long anyone wants to linger here, but shameless promotion. We've just flown a flag to see if anyone likes it. I've flown a kite in the community section of the WOVA interface, seeing if anyone wants to have a quick breakout, as is tradition in person on tomorrow, just after Josh's community update. See what you think. Please follow that if you would. Anything more from you, Julie or Ed, to round out, or indeed anyone else?
I think so. Not for me.
Thanks
anyway.
everybody for coming. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Please join us on a call and drop us a line.
Great. Thanks, folks. Thanks to Julie, Ronald, Ed. I'll end the recording here, and we'll see you in future 3D spaces.